Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where your curiosity really drives what we explore. You send us sources, and we dig in, trying to pull out the key insights. The idea is to give you a genuine shortcut to understanding some pretty complex topics, hopefully sparking some of those aha moments without completely burying you in detail.
Right. And today, we're plunging into the world of Walt Disney. I mean, what a name, right? Instantly brings up ideas of magic, maybe American ingenuity.
Definitely. And to help us navigate this, we've been looking at excerpts from a YouTube documentary called Walt Disney, The Devil in the Dream Factory.
Yeah, and it offers, a whole range of perspectives on his life, his career, which was incredibly innovative, let's be honest, and the huge impact he had on entertainment and really culture in general.
So our mission today, for you, our learner, is to really try and get a handle on what drove Walt Disney to achieve so much and maybe get a clearer sense of the person behind the myth. And we're grounding all of this in the details from that documentary.
Okay, so where do we even start with someone like Walt Disney? The story. It feels like it's always been there.
Well, the documentary kind of kicks off by hinting at this deep ambition, right, from the early days.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Even before the mouse, before the fame, the source material points to some key things pretty early on. Like back in 1919, after he served in World War I,
Okay.
young Walt, he's back in Chicago, working at his father's jelly factory, earning over $500, which for the time was actually pretty respectable.
That sounds like a solid path for most people back then.
Totally. A stable job. But the documentary really stresses that, Disney wasn't wired that way. He wasn't someone content with just a conventional working class life. He had this different kind of energy.
Yeah, the documentary highlights that ready, fire, aim approach he had.
Exactly. Instead of mapping everything out perfectly, he'd just jump in, full of ideas, wanting to make them happen, even if all the details weren't quite nailed down yet.
And there was this drive for attention too, right? Like needing recognition. The documentary sort of implies talent was his way to that. What do you make of that?
It's interesting, isn't it? And what's striking is how fast that general ambition seemed to find a very specific focus. It wasn't just success anywhere.
Right.
The documentary makes it clear his passion was animation, and it wasn't something he discovered later. It supposedly went right back to his childhood.
So leaving the factory job wasn't just about escaping boredom. It was about chasing that specific dream.
Precisely. That's what led him to pack up and head back to Kansas City. He'd lived there before to try and break into advertising.
But even the advertising work, it sounds like his mind was already elsewhere. The documentary mentions him going to the movies practically every night.
Yeah, totally immersed. It seems he just got the potential of this new film industry right away. And it wasn't just watching. Even with, only a few months of formal art training?
Not much, really.
No, but he was already thinking, hey, I could do this better, especially the animation he was seeing.
What was it about animation specifically that grabbed him so much?
The documentary suggests he saw this unique way to bring imagination to life, something other types of film couldn't quite do at the time. And you hear about him experimenting, like late at night, using a borrowed camera.
Making his own little shorts.
Yeah, these little gagged up shorts, as the source calls them. He even managed to sell some to a local theater chain. Didn't always cover his costs, apparently, but just the fact he was doing it.
Shows that drive.
Absolutely. That willingness to just try things, learn by doing, it really stands out.
And it wasn't like everyone was cheering him on. His father, Elias, the documentary paints him as pretty skeptical.
Right, and that skepticism apparently created real anxiety for Walt. This fear, of failing and having to go back basically under his father's thumb again.
It sounds like a classic clash of personalities. Walt, the energetic dreamer, and Elias, the sort of stern, demanding father figure.
The documentary really contrasts them, and it suggests Walt was almost consciously trying to be the opposite of his dad. Maybe that whole dynamic just fueled his determination even more.
You mean proving him wrong was part of the motivation?
Could be. It wasn't just about building a career. Maybe it was about forging his own identity, completely separate from his father's world. And you see that ambition laid out pretty clearly. There's a letter mentioned to a New York cartoon distributor.
What did it say?
He's pitching this idea, something new and clever in cartoons, combining live action with animation, his Alice in Cartoonland idea. Pretty bold for the time.
And he really went through tough times trying to make it happen, didn't he? The documentary mentions him basically living in his office.
Oh, yeah, scraping by. bathing at train stations, surviving on almost nothing, just pure determination to keep his ideas alive, even when his first company, Laugh-O-Grams, went bust.
That must have been crushing.
You'd think so. He even apparently briefly thought about becoming a live-action movie director instead, but something kept pulling him back to animation.
What do you think that was? Despite all the failures.
Well, the documentary seems to imply that animation itself, the creative potential, the chance to innovate, it just had this stronger hold on him. More than maybe the more established path of directing actors at that point. He seemed to just fundamentally believe in it.
Which brings us to the big move, Los Angeles.
Right. His brother Roy was already out there for health reasons. And then comes this telegram, Winkler Pictures, offering a deal for 12 of those Alice shorts.
That sounds like the break he needed.
It was huge. But interestingly, the documentary notes that Roy, he was hesitant at first.
Really? Why?
Well, again, Roy seems to be the practical one, right? The cautious one. Walt's plans probably sounded, I don't know, a bit pie in the sky, maybe financially risky. Animation was still pretty new, pretty unpredictable.
So Roy's hesitation kind of highlights their different approaches.
Exactly, and that balance, that dynamic between them, turned out to be incredibly important later on.
That partnership does seem absolutely key. They pool their money, borrowing from friends, family.
And set up shop literally in the back room of a real estate office, just the two of them initially.
Walt handling the creative side, the ideas.
And Roy handling the money, the business side, the general manager. But Walt also knew his own limits, artistically speaking.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. He convinces Ubiworks, this incredibly talented animator from Kansas City, much more skilled technically, to come join them.
What does that tell us? That he recognized he needed help.
I think it shows remarkable self-awareness, actually. The documentary points this out. Walt knew his ideas were strong, but maybe his drawing was just okay. Recognizing iWorks was better, faster. It shows he valued collaboration, valued talent, even if it meant admitting someone else was technically superior. That was smart.
And bringing iWorks in paid off pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah. iWorks apparently redesigned the Alice shorts, making the cartoon characters more central, more engaging alongside the live-action girl.
And the distributor liked it.
Loved it, apparently. More demand, better payments. Which meant they could finally start hiring more people, bringing guys out from Missouri, hiring locals, starting to build a real team.
And Roy's role here was crucial too, wasn't it? Setting up the business side properly this time.
Absolutely vital, according to the documentary. This wasn't going to be another Laugh-O-Grams failure. There was a proper financial structure this time. And you see the results. They start making some money.
Buying cars, even.
Yeah, Roy gets a solid sedan. Walt gets a flashy Moon Roadster. They buy neighboring lots, build houses. It signals, a level of stability they just hadn't had before.
And then Walt gets married to Lillian Bounds, one of the ink artists working there.
Right. And the documentary includes this description from her saying he was uninhibited, natural, and funny. It gives you a glimpse of his personality, doesn't it? That charm. Quite different from the image of his dad.
How do you think that personal side helped him?
Well, someone described like that. They're probably pretty engaging, right? Good at building relationships, which would be invaluable when you're trying to build a studio, deal with distributors, get people excited about your vision. That natural energy probably made people want to believe in him.
By early 26, things are really humming. A new Alice short every 16 days. That's productive.
Incredibly. They moved to a bigger studio on Hyperion Avenue, and Walt's clearly looking ahead, setting his sights high, aiming for the top dog in animation at the time, Felix the cat.
So he wanted to compete with the best. What does that ambition tell us?
Well, what's interesting, as the documentary notes, is that he was aware of what animation was like then, often kind of crude, sometimes a bit adult-oriented.
Right.
But Walt, even early on, seemed to want something different. He wasn't just chasing technical skill, he was searching for his voice, his own style. That desire to innovate, to be distinct, seems really central.
But that drive also meant he expected a lot from his team.
Yeah, the documentary mentions his high standards. He could be demanding, critical, if things weren't up to par. Which maybe sets the stage for what happened next. A huge setback.
The Oswald the Lucky Rabbit situation.
Exactly. Losing Oswald to Charles Mintz, that was a massive blow.
Can you unpack that? Why was it so significant?
Mintz was Margaret Winkler's husband, the distributor. He essentially maneuvered to take control of the rights to Oswald, this character Walt had created and was having success with. And worse, he poached a lot of Walt's key animators. Even iWorks left for a time.
Wow. So he lost his character and his team.
Pretty much. The documentary likens it to losing a child, plus losing your financial security all at once. A real crisis point.
And this leads to that famous train ride back from New York after the Oswald deal fell apart. The documentary really emphasizes this moment, connecting it to Marceline, Missouri.
Yeah, his childhood home for a few years. It's portrayed as this almost idyllic time, freedom, nature, a real contrast to his stern father and the hard farm work.
Why does the documentary stress Marceline so much here?
Well, Marceline, as presented, was this incredibly important formative period, a time of imagination before the family moved back to the city. The source suggests Walt really held on to those memories, so losing Oswald, this creation of his, maybe it tapped into that older feeling of loss, like losing Marceline itself. It seems to have been this deeply emotional moment that, paradoxically, sparked something new.
So March 1928, Walt and Lillian get back to L.A., probably feeling pretty low. The documentary even hints that these repeated failures might have reminded him of his own father's struggles.
Yeah, it must have been a dark time. But then, incredibly, out of that low point comes Mickey Mouse. It's just an amazing turnaround.
How did that happen?
Well, the documentary details how Mickey's design, that simple, iconic look, the circles, the thin legs, was largely by works again, working from Walt's basic idea for a mouse character.
And Lillian named him.
Yeah, the story goes Walt initially called him Mortimer, but Lillian suggested Mickey. A much better fit, I think we can all agree.
Definitely. And Walt poured himself into this character, didn't he? Seeing Mickey as this underdog.
Very much so. An underdog who needed a stronger voice, which, as the documentary points out, probably felt a lot like Walt's own situation right then. He needed a win.
And then, almost immediately, he gets obsessed with new technology. Synchronized sound.
Yes. This becomes his next big thing. He sees the potential.
Why jump on sound so fast? It sounds risky.
Oh, it was a huge gamble. The documentary makes that clear. Sound and animation, technically difficult, incredibly expensive. No guarantee it would work or that audiences would even like it.
Especially after just losing Oswald. You'd think he'd play it safe.
But maybe because he'd lost Oswald, he felt he had to innovate, do something completely new, something nobody else was doing, to really make a mark. He wasn't afraid to take that chance.
So he goes back to New York, secures a deal for a sound system, even tells Roy to sell his car to pay for recording.
That's the story. Shows his determination. But even with the tech, finding a distributor willing to bet on a sound cartoon that took 3 months of struggling in New York.
What kept him pushing them?
The documentary implies that just this unshakable belief. He'd invested so much creatively and financially in sound. He must have been convinced this was the future, this was what would set them apart, that core optimism, that belief in his own ideas, even when things looked bleak. It seems to be a recurring theme.
And then, Steamboat Willie, everything changes.
Bang! Huge success, overnight sensation, pretty much. The documentary argues this is what really put Disney Studios on the map as a major player. And Mickey Mouse, well, he became a star.
What was it about Steamboat Willie specifically?
Several things the documentary suggests. The novelty of sound obviously was huge, but Mickey himself, his energy, his personality, this little guy who could dance and make music, it felt incredibly fresh and alive with the sound.
And he really connected with people, especially during the Depression.
Deeply, yeah. The documentary highlights this idea of Mickey as the underdog who faces obstacles but always comes out on top, usually gets the girl. It tapped into this collective need for hope, for resilience during really tough times.
That emotional connection sounds key.
Absolutely. And you see it in things like the Mickey Mouse clubs sprouting up everywhere. Over 1 million kids join. That's massive cultural impact. And Roy, being Roy,
Saw the money potential.
immediately saw the licensing potential. Let's put Mickey on things.
Though the documentary says those early deals weren't great financially.
Not until Kay Kamen came along. The documentary calls him a marketing genius. He apparently negotiated much better deals, exclusive rights, a bigger cut for Disney, and then boom, Mickey merchandise floods the market.
Like the watch, the most popular watch in America.
Exactly. It just shows the scale and the fan mail. Piles of it addressed to Mickey, addressed to Walt. He was becoming known worldwide.
So while the country struggled, Disney was actually doing pretty well thanks to these products.
Yeah, it shows real business smarts alongside the creativity. And the documentary emphasizes Walt's personal link to Mickey. Seeing him as an alter ego, even doing the voice himself. By his late 20s, he's the first real animation celebrity.
It's an incredible rise. But success changes things.
Yeah.
Right? His role in the studio starts shifting.
Inevitably, yeah. The documentary notes he moves more into supervising, directing. Less hands-on animation himself, which apparently didn't sit entirely well with him at first, caused him some distress.
What do you think that was? Moving up.
Well, for someone so involved, so hands-on from the start, maybe stepping back felt like losing that direct creative connection. The documentary hints it was a tough adjustment, even if it was necessary for growth.
And this shift coincides with maybe a more demanding side emerging.
The documentary paints that picture. More anxious, maybe obsessive, chain-smoking, tapping his fingers impatiently in meetings. And there's personal stuff going on, too. Wanting a big family, then the heartbreak of Lillian's miscarriage.
How might those pressures have affected him as a leader?
You have to imagine they added to the intensity. Then the documentary mentions their first real vacation in 1931, and afterwards Walt saying the Depression was a godsend, which is quite a perspective, maybe a way of reframing huge challenges as, I don't know, focusing events.
That leads us nicely into the silly symphonies.
Right. The documentary positions these as a really deliberate step, moving animation towards being seen as a proper art form. The skeleton dance is the prime example given.
What was so special about them?
They were all about experimentation, pushing beyond just gags, exploring how animation could work with music, rhythm, creating mood, personifying nature. The skeleton dance just blended it all in this totally new way.
And this raised their profile.
Hugely. Elevated Walt's reputation among artists, animators. Talent started flocking to the studio. Staff numbers grew significantly. Though the documentary also notes the gender dynamics, men animating, women mostly in ink and paint paid less, a reflection of the times, and the Depression economy, it suggests.
But within that, he was making animation seem like a real career path.
Yeah, recognizing talent, paying well for the top people. It created this environment where creativity could really flourish. And the silly symphonies were the perfect lab for trying new things.
Like technology.
Exactly. Sound, obviously, but then color, Technicolor. And the big one, the multiplane camera. That was revolutionary.
Creating depth.
Yeah, this amazing sense of three-dimensional space in a 2D medium. Absolutely crucial for the kind of visual storytelling Walt was aiming for. He saw the studio as a place to make great art, and he kept pushing his team towards that.
His leadership style sounds interesting. Jovial, first names, but also demanding.
A bit of a paradox, right? Fostering creativity, bringing in lectures on art history, Impressionism, Cubism, creating a space where people felt safe to experiment, even fail. But he also had incredibly high standards and a very clear vision. He wanted this family, this community, but it was definitely his vision they were working towards.
And all this builds towards the next huge leap, Snow White.
The big one, yeah. The documentary stresses his determination here. This wasn't just going to be a long cartoon. It had to grab people emotionally. Could animation make you cry? That was apparently a question he was asking.
That's a radical idea for animation back then.
Totally revolutionary. Elevating it to feature-length drama. It meant rethinking everything.
And his focus on realism was intense, bringing in live animals.
Deer, birds, yeah.
Yeah.
Having animators study them. Even the documentary says having someone throw stuff through glass so they could see exactly how it shattered to draw it realistically, and hiring a live-action model for Snow White herself.
Why go to such lengths for realism in a cartoon?
It seems he believed that grounding the fantasy in believable movement and emotion was key to getting that deep audience connection he wanted. It required this incredible level of detail, nuance, far beyond typical cartooning.
Pushing animation towards actual performance. Animators taking acting lessons.
Right. Studying facial muscles, lip movements. Because there was no roadmap for this, no rules for feature animation, it was wide open creatively. But technically, logistically, a nightmare.
And Walt's commitment to every detail slowed things down.
Immensely. The documentary talks about the glacial pace, sometimes a whole day just to get a single close-up drawing right, over 200,000 separate drawings in total. It needed an army of artists.
They outgrew the studio space.
Completely. Even the new edition wasn't enough. Roy had to keep renting more buildings nearby just to fit everyone in, over 600 staff by the end, apparently.
And Roy's job. Managing the money through all this.
Must have been incredibly stressful. Walt's vision just kept expanding. The budget kept climbing. The documentary mentions constant budget talks, growing worry from the Bank of America as deadlines kept getting pushed.
And it got really down to the wire, didn't it? Like 10 months before the premiere, nothing was even filmed.
It's unbelievable. The pressure must have been immense. But the documentary suggests Walt just wouldn't compromise. No rushing, no cutting corners, which forced Roy to eventually increase the budget 6 times over the original estimate.
Leading to that nickname, Disney's folly.
Yeah, the industry was skeptical, whispering. And you have to remember the intense work, especially from the ink and paint department, mostly women, working incredibly long hours. The documentary suggests they were really driven by belief in the project itself. And those last cells weren't finished until weeks before the premiere. Just incredible.
So, the premiere night, December 1937. Hollywood's buzzing about this $1.5 million cartoon.
Star-studded event, and the documentary paints Walt as understandably anxious. He gives these brief, humble opening remarks.
And then the film starts. What was the reaction like?
Captivated. Totally captivated, according to the source. Gasps at the visuals, laughter at the dwarves, hissing at the queen. And then, the big moment. Snow White's apparent death.
Silence.
Silence. And then apparently audible weeping throughout the theater. The documentary argues this was the moment Walt knew he'd done it. People were completely lost in the story, forgetting they were watching drawings.
Even Hollywood stars were crying.
Gable, Lombard, reportedly moved to tears. And at the end, a massive standing ovation. Our rival producer apparently said, "We are in the presence of film history." He knew.
And the film's impact lasted, even with kids finding parts scary.
Right. The documentary suggests it showed Disney understood kids could handle complex emotions, that animation could carry these deep, almost mythic themes.
And commercially,
Yeah.
it was a smash hit.
Huge. Earned $8 million in its first run, which was unprecedented. Roy paid off all the studio's debt. And then came the merchandising wave, tying products directly to the film. A total triumph, artistically and financially.
Walt becomes this American icon,
Right.
master of technology, storytelling, art, commerce, the whole package.
Honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale. Yale called him the creator of a new art form. And the documentary touches on his playful side, his love for kids, a contrast maybe to Lillian's reserve, possibly a reaction to his own strict father.
But despite the fame, he still held on to that narrative of his tough upbringing.
Yeah, the documentary notes that. Believed in hard work and felt like an outsider in Hollywood still. Maybe felt animation wasn't getting its due respect.
Which might explain his reaction to the Oscars that year.
Possibly. Snow White wasn't nominated for Best Picture, despite everything. He got a special honorary Oscar, one big one and 7 little ones, but the documentary says it felt like a slap in the face to him. He knew how groundbreaking it was.
So how do you follow up something like Snow White?
Big question. The next projects mentioned are Bambi and Pinocchio, both kind of coming-of-age stories. But Bambi ran into trouble early on, so Pinocchio got prioritized.
And this was around the time his mother died.
Yes, a major personal blow. The documentary describes him as grieving privately, returning to work, not really talking about it, suggests he internalized a lot, maybe poured it into the work.
And that famous quote comes from around this time. We are not making cartoons anymore.
We are creating art.
Yeah.
Really signals that shift in ambition. For him, the standard was the audience's emotional response. That was the measure of art.
And his approach to adapting stories like Pinocchio, he wasn't afraid to change things.
Not at all, according to the source. Took liberties, focused on the themes he cared about, like what it means to be human in Pinocchio, and really made them his own. But even with these big projects, his attention was apparently already drifting.
To something else.
Yeah, to Fantasia.
Ah, the experimental one. How did that come about?
It started smaller, based on The Sorcerer's Apprentice, with Mickey and the conductor, Leopold Stokowski. But it just grew into this feature film idea. 8 different classical pieces, visualized with animation.
Sounds ambitious.
Hugely. The documentary describes the studio becoming this amazing hub of talent, musicians, dancers, even scientists like Edwin Hubble consulted. Stravinsky, Balanchine were involved.
And artistically, it was a departure, wasn't it? More abstract.
Yeah, Walt exploring emotion through abstraction, moving away from the realism push of the previous films, aiming for, like, timeless art, on par with the greats. But the studio was stretched incredibly thin.
Juggling 3 massive films at once.
And the staff had almost doubled again. They desperately needed more space, which led Walt to, well, make a big decision.
Buying the land in Burbank. Without telling Roy.
That's how the documentary frames it. Roy was in Europe. Walt picks out this 51-acre lot. The new studio was designed for efficiency, community, even ideas for apartments on site. The goal. The perfect place to make perfect films. They started moving in right after Christmas, 1939. New buildings, commissary gym, the works.
But Pinocchio and Fantasia didn't quite hit the mark financially, did they?
No, despite their artistic merits, Pinocchio, the documentary notes, had these darker themes: being swallowed by a whale, constant danger, the quest for humanity through being brave and truthful. Critically acclaimed, yes, but it cost nearly twice as much as Snow White to make, and ticket sales were slow. The war in Europe didn't help either.
And Fantasia, even riskier.
Much riskier. Opening with pure abstract animation set to Bach. Very unconventional. The film was uneven, amazing moments, but other parts didn't land as well. Critics were extremely divided.
How did Walt take the criticism?
Not well, apparently. The documentary suggests it might have fueled a bit of an anti-intellectual streak later on. And financially, Fantasia lost even more money than Pinocchio, partly because only a few theaters had the special sound system it required.
So the company was struggling financially.
Yeah, couldn't pay dividends to stockholders.
Yeah.
And that expensive new Burbank studio suddenly felt like a massive weight rather than an advantage.
What was the vibe like inside that new studio?
The documentary paints a picture of, well, maybe too much efficiency, almost sterile. It potentially stifled some of that earlier creative chaos. People were more separated by task, more like a factory.
And more hierarchy.
Definitely. A more rigid structure.
Yeah.
Tiered benefits, like the fancy penthouse club for the top creative guys, all men with better offices. There's an anecdote about an animator, Don Lusk.
What happened?
He apparently helped out with some lower-level work, and when he got back to his office, his carpet and nice furniture were gone, as if, he'd lowered himself. It suggests Walt maybe didn't value the less star roles as much.
And the pay disparity was becoming an issue.
A big issue. By 1940, lower-paid workers were really feeling the pinch, aware of how much Walt himself was making. The commissary was too pricey for many. Dissatisfaction was brewing.
But Walt didn't see it, still insisting everyone call him Walt.
Seemed largely unaware, or maybe unwilling to see it, according to the source. Spending more time in his private office, less connected to the floor.
And this is happening just as unions are gaining power in Hollywood.
Exactly. Federal law in 1935 allowed collective bargaining. Unions were organizing everywhere. The Screen Cartoonists Guild had organized pretty much every animation department except Disney.
And Disney employed, what, half the industry?
Over half, so it was the big prize, the major battleground for animation unions. But Walt saw the studio as his family, believed he was being generous. A very paternalistic view, the documentary suggests.
Then Art Babbitt speaks out, a top animator, created Goofy.
Highly paid, highly respected. But he becomes a vocal union supporter, critical of the conditions, the lack of credit and pay for the artists doing the bulk of the work. He tells this story about a young painter fainting from malnutrition, highlighting the disparity Walt seemed blind to.
How did Walt react when he found out about the union drive?
Fury. Absolute fury, according to the documentary. He gives this speech to the staff, basically telling them to trust him, work hard, and ignore these outsiders. Then he fires Babbitt.
Which backfired.
Big time. It galvanized the workers. They voted to support the guild, and on May 29th, 1941, they went on strike.
Forcing Walt to cross his own picket line.
Over 200 striking employees. And Babbitt is right there, confronting him, heckling him. It apparently got physical. Walt just couldn't believe so many had turned against him.
How did he explain it to himself?
Conspiracy theories, basically. The documentary highlights how he publicly blamed communism in a trade ad. He needed a villain, and anti-communism was a convenient banner, aligning him with other industrialists fighting unions.
And his father died during the strike.
Yes. Elias passed away. And Walt didn't go back for the funeral. It was a deeply bitter, tumultuous time. Roy, meanwhile, was apparently more pragmatic, seeing the union as inevitable.
The strike must have hurt production. And Walt, emotionally.
Tremendously on both counts. But he kept pushing forward on Bambi. He'd been working on it for years, deeply invested.
Bambi finally comes out in 1942. Ambitious, artistic.
Praised for its artistry, its depiction of nature, pushed realism even further, but also traumatic for audiences. That scene with the mother.
Yeah.
And the documentary suggests that maybe Disney by this point was starting to feel a bit out of sync with the times. Bambi didn't make back its costs initially. Walt blamed the war.
It also mentions the variety of styles in those first 5 features. No single Disney style yet.
Right. Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi, Dumbo, all quite different. And the documentary speculates that maybe losing that early, scrappier, more collaborative vibe impacted the later films somehow.
After the war, he turns to American folklore, Song of the South.
Yeah, adapting the Uncle Remus stories by Joel Chandler Harris, moving away from European fairy tales, focusing on this theme of the outsider, again, the white boy, the black boy, Uncle Remus. He'd bought the rights back in 39.
But the source material,
Hmm.
set on a post-Civil War plantation, incredibly sensitive.
Hugely sensitive. Issues of slavery, race, in a deeply segregated America. The documentary raises the question, can you tell joyful stories through a character who lived through slavery in that setting?
Did he consult anyone?
He did seek input, the documentary notes. From black intellectuals, activists, the NAACP, they warned him about stereotypes. But the source suggests he largely ignored the advice and went his own way.
And the reaction?
Divided doesn't quite cover it, premiered in Atlanta. Some positive reviews praised the look, the nostalgia, but many others, like the New York Times, slammed it for romanticizing the master-slave dynamic. The NAACP called it dangerous, called for boycotts. Walt was apparently baffled by the backlash.
And around this time, animation itself is changing. UPA emerges.
United Productions of America. Totally different style, modern art influenced, stylized, a direct contrast to Disney's realism. Offered more creative freedom. Attracted some ex-Disney guys like Art Babbitt.
How did Walt view UPA?
Negatively, according to the source, reportedly called them those goddamn communists down the river, which ties into the post-war anti-communist climate.
Right. The strikes start up again. Studios want to break the unions.
And Walt co-founds that anti-communist group, the Motion Picture Alliance, which leads to his HUAC testimony in 47.
Testifying about Reds in films.
Yeah, and the recent strikes, the documentary says he focused on union leaders like Herbert Sorrell, accusing them of being communists based on, well, hearsay and associations.
Did he say he knew for sure?
No, he admitted he didn't know, but he believed Sorrell probably was. His testimony and others was praised by anti-union forces. The documentary presents it as providing cover for the studio's efforts, contributing to the blacklist. Disney was part of that.
So post-war, the studio's busy, but Walt's looking for new directions.
Seems so. Producing a lot, but exploring other things. Live-action films in England, Treasure Island, nostalgic American stories, so dear to my heart. Television was on his radar, too.
And the nature documentaries. True life adventures.
Yeah, starting with Seal Island. Groundbreaking. But the documentary notes his tendency to impose narratives onto nature, make it story-like. But he apparently missed animation.
Wanted to go back to features.
Yeah?
Despite Roy's worries.
Yes. Around 1949, the documentary recounts this big blow-up. Walt basically gives Roy an ultimatum, fund animation or I sell the business. Heated argument. Roy caves.
And personally, he seemed a bit isolated, relying on the studio nurse.
Hazel George. For back rubs, scotch, company. The documentary suggests maybe a lack of close friends, and then that really poignant admission to someone that he felt he'd never top Snow White. Sounds like a bit of a crisis.
But then trains.
Trains, yeah, late 1948. Hazel George suggests he go to a railroad convention. He goes with animator Ward Kimball, tells him stories about his life, and comes back completely obsessed with model trains.
Like seriously obsessed.
Orders a huge model setup for the studio, starts spending tons of time building it, working on it. The documentary suggests it was a way to find control, solace maybe. A critic visiting for Cinderella found him more interested in his miniature engine than the movie.
But Cinderella was a success, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, big time. Released early 1950, hailed as a return to form, made good money, gave the studio breathing room, though Walt apparently still saw flaws in it.
And the train obsession continued.
He built a scale model of his old barn from Marceline, spent hours designing tracks, building the engine, like a childhood toy he never had, the documentary suggests. Salvador Dali apparently observed he was seeking this impossible perfection in the models, a comfort maybe when the real world disappointed.
Which leads somehow to Disneyland.
Right. Early 52, Lillian senses something big is brewing. Walt starts selling personal assets, sells the rights to his name to the company.
Why would he do that?
To fund a new company. WED Enterprises. Walter Elias Disney. Just for brainstorming new ideas. Reminiscent, the documentary notes, of the early Mickey days. His idea was for something on unused land near the studio.
Starting as Mickey Mouse Village.
Then evolving into Disneyland. But by late 52, the plans were already way too big for that small lot. He starts pulling top talent from the studio over to WED. Roy, meanwhile.
Still skeptical, called it a mad idea.
Yeah, this hugely expensive amusement park. But Roy makes a crucial trip to New York to pitch a weekly TV show. with a condition.
The network had to help fund Disneyland.
Exactly. They whip up this amazing drawing of the whole park concept by Herb Ryman literally right before the meetings. NBC and CBS say no. But ABC, the underdog network, they bite.
And the construction begins in Anaheim. Huge scale.
Massive, with that main street based on Marceline. Artificial rivers, the castle, the railroad, and that berm around it to block out the real world, but the timeline. 6 months. Seemed impossible.
But the timing was right. Mid-50s America.
Perfect timing, the documentary suggests. Suburbia booming, TVs and homes, baby boomers needing entertainment, families with disposable income. People wanted escapism.
And Walt used his TV show to build the hype.
Masterfully. Presenting Disneyland as this magical place, talking directly to kids very respectfully. The show highlighted the different lands: Adventureland, Tomorrowland, Fantasyland, Frontierland.
And Frontierland. Davy Crockett.
Became a massive craze. Viewership soared. The theme song was a huge hit. Coonskin caps everywhere. The documentary notes the underlying message to follow your own path, question authority.
Walt was deeply involved in building the park itself.
Every single detail, apparently. Daily visits, specific instructions, relentless enthusiasm, solving problems on the fly.
But it was a scramble to finish.
Totally frantic. Last-minute issues, a plumber's strike. Walt prioritizing bathrooms over water fountains because it was so urgent. But he was reportedly thrilled as opening day approached.
The opening day broadcast on ABC. Big deal.
Biggest live broadcast ever attempted then. But plagued with problems. Technical glitches, mishaps, and the park itself. Overcrowded, asphalt melting, long lines. Pretty disastrous first impression in the press.
How did Walt react to the chaos?
Seemed happy, actually, according to the source. Acknowledged everyone's hard work. Maybe just relieved it was open.
And despite the rough start, it took off.
Big time. Open to the public the next day. 1 million visitors in 10 weeks. 5 million a year eventually. Became the place to visit. Even foreign leaders had to see it. A symbol of America, in a way.
An idealized America, though, right?
Very much so. That idealized small-town Main Street, celebrating certain ideals, but, as the documentary points out, often smoothing over the complicated, painful parts of history. It was designed as an escape, a curated perfection.
What did critics think initially?
Mixed bag, the documentary says. Some praised the vision, the immersion, others called it sanitized, too commercial. Walt himself seemed to see it as his personal kingdom, had that apartment over the fire station.
Walking around incognito.
Yeah, watching people's reactions. And that famous line when asked about running for president.
Why would I want to be president? I am the king of Disneyland.
Says it all, doesn't it? He goes back to Marceline in '56 for a park dedication, clearly enjoying being the hometown hero who made it big. Seems he was really internalizing this role as a symbol.
And the TV show kept going strong. Uncle Walt.
That persona became so ingrained, even though he'd sometimes forget his lines on the show, people wanted to believe in that friendly image.
Was he aware of the difference between the public Walt and the private Walt?
The documentary suggests he was, acknowledged his smoking, drinking off camera, and in the studio, still demanding, that cough signaling he was nearby. Praise was rare, it'll work, was apparently high praise from him, but he still inspired intense loyalty.
And creatively, he wasn't slowing down. Still driven.
Seems so. Revisiting old ideas, like for Song of the South animation years later, believed strongly in shaping kids through stories, the underlying themes. He saw Mary Poppins not just as fantasy, but about healing a broken family.
Mary Poppins was another huge success. Summer of '64.
Critical and commercial hit. 13 Oscar nominations, including his first and only one for Best Picture. Must have felt like real validation. But it came out during a really turbulent time in America.
Civil rights, Vietnam, a growing gap between Disney's world and reality.
Exactly. The documentary highlights this tension. Defenders saw his films as wholesome escapes. Critics saw them as ignoring reality, lacking diversity, sanitizing things.
Did the criticism bother him?
He was aware of it, the source suggests, but fundamentally refused to change his vision. His focus was already shifting again anyway.
To Florida. Project Future.
Yeah, something totally different from Disneyland. This evolved into EPCOT, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. He saw this as his real legacy. Not just entertainment, but a contribution.
A real city.
That was the vision. A planned city showcasing American innovation, community, progress. High-density center, greenbelt, residential areas, efficient transport, major companies doing R&D there, climate-controlled downtown.
It sounds incredibly ambitious. Almost utopian.
It was deeply personal for him, too. The documentary mentions him imagining sitting on a park bench there with Lily, just watching his future city function.
But his health was failing by then.
Seriously failing. The strain was immense, needing oxygen between takes for the TV show in '66, constant pain, neck, shoulder, hip. He told Hazel George his nerves were frayed.
Then the surgery and the cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, scheduled spinal surgery. They found the mass in his lung. Prognosis, maybe 2 years, max. The documentary describes him telling his team quietly, offering rare praise, a wink, then hospitalization.
Roy was with him near the end.
Visited him, yeah. Massaged his cold feet.
On December 14th, 1966, Walt sent Lillian home to rest. Roy stayed. And Walt, even then, was apparently talking about Disney World, EPCOT, pointing out roots on the ceiling.
Still planning.
Right up to the end. Then the next morning, the news spread through the studio. He was gone, age 65. Just profound shock and grief.
What an impact he had, compared to figures like Thalberg. Front-page news worldwide. His quote about laughter being universal, and his empire, Disneyland. It just kept going, kept growing after he died.
The legacy is complicated, though, isn't it?
Very. The documentary acknowledges both sides. Provider of happiness, shaper of American identity, or creator of falsity, cultural homogenization. He represented something powerful about 20th century America.
But the films themselves, they tapped into something deep.
Universal themes, the documentary argues. Growing up, loss, death, drawing on myths, classic story arcs. Few people covered as much cultural ground as Walt Disney. He just seemed to understand or maybe anticipate the American psyche in this uncanny way.
So wrapping up this deep dive into the documentary, we've really traced that relentless ambition from the very beginning, haven't we?
Yeah, through the creative genius, the constant innovation, but also the demanding nature, the sharp business mind. His impact on animation, on entertainment itself is just undeniable.
And we touched on some of the controversies, the complexities, the early struggles, the vital partnership with Roy, the absolute mountain they climbed with Snow White.
Right, and the darker sides, too. His personality shifts, the later obsessions like the trains, and then that incredible, almost science fiction vision for EPCOT.
So for you, our learner, we really hope this has given you a richer, maybe more nuanced understanding of this towering figure, digging into the details provided by the source.
Which leaves us with a final question for you to chew on. Now that you've heard about the complex reality of Walt Disney, beyond just a familiar image, how does that change how you think about his creations? Those films, the parks, their place in our culture. What parts of his fierce drive and vision still feel relevant today? And are there maybe lessons or even warnings in the contradictions of his approach that apply to things we try to build or achieve? Something to think about.